Hi everyone, thanks for joining us at the Resolution Foundation this morning. We're talking today about housing and ethnic inequalities. I'm still in month one at the Resolution Foundation, and really one of the reasons I joined is because of their ability to do innovative analysis that is really relevant to the lives of low-income families, and I cannot take any credit for the report today because the work was basically done before I arrived, but I think this is a really standout example of that. So it's a pleasure to be convening a discussion about it today, particularly as we're joined by some panellists who I think can really help us understand the experience of families behind the data and also what the government and others might be able to do to make things better. So should be a great discussion. I am joined by Florence Eshelami, who, as well as being the MP for Vauxhall and Camberwell Green, is also the chair of the Housing, Communities and Local Government Select Committee. So it'll be great to hear from Florence about how the report resonates both with her experience as an MP and the work that the Select Committee are doing. Also delighted to be joined by Kwejo Tweneboa, who is a social issues campaigner with a focus on housing. After initially campaigning for change in his Eastfields estate in Mitcham, he's campaigned for improvements in housing across the country. Last year he published a book, Our Country in Crisis, on how to improve housing in Britain and issues that stem from that. And Cameron Aref Adib, last but absolutely not least, is an economist here at the Resolution Foundation. He is the co-author of, sorry, I can't look at you, Cameron, or the mic breaks, so I'm going to look this way. He's the co-author of today's excellent report with Felicia Adampton, who's also here. We will take our usual format here at the Resolution Foundation, so Cameron will give us a quick outline of the report. We'll then hear from Florence and Kwejo about their reactions, and we will have plenty of time for questions. You can ask questions in the room. You can also ask questions online using Slido and hashtag #NoPlace. Great, let's kick off. Cameron, over to you.
Thanks, Ruth. And so I'm here to present some report that we published today, No Place Like Home, that's looking at the cost and conditions on housing for ethnic minority households. I'd like to thank my co-author, Felicia Adampton, for all her work on this report as well. So we know that the UK has become a more plural country. If we look at census data from 2021, around 75% of the population identified as white British in that census, and that's down from a figure of 87% in the early 2000s. But we know that there are still some significant ethnic inequalities that are persisting in the country, and we look at an area that we think has been slightly underexplored, and that's around housing affordability in the paper. So we start with this chart, which shows that all ethnic minority groups spend a larger share of their income on housing than their white British counterparts. So what this chart shows you is that on average, among white British adults, they spend around 11% of their income on housing. And if you look all the way down on the other end of the scale, those from black other backgrounds spend around a quarter of their income on housing, and those from Arab backgrounds spend over a quarter of their income on housing. And what you can see is that it's actually higher for all of these ethnic groups. And it's not just a low income story. What this chart shows you is the average unequivalized, which means not taking into account household size, weekly income by ethnicity. And what you see is that for some ethnic groups, it's quite a bit higher than the white British group. So for instance, for Indian and Chinese group, it's some way above what the average is for white British adults. But if we went back to our previous chart, you still see that those two groups still spend on average a larger share of income on housing. And I do just want to sort of put a pin in the unequivalized point where we don't take into account household size, because I'll come back to that later. So really what we see is that housing costs are a big driver of this. It's not just about low income. So what could explain the housing affordability gap? So we boil it down initially into three reasons. One, the tenure differences. Ethnic minorities are a lot less likely to be homeowners, and they're more likely to live in the private rented sector than their white British counterparts. So what this chart shows you is the percentage of the population by each ethnic group that either own outright their home, own with mortgage, social renters or private renters. And what you can see if you look at the sort of the blue bar at the end, all minority groups are a lot more likely to live in the private rented sector some substantially so. If you look at, for instance, the black other group at nearly 50%, the black African group at 37%, the Arab group at 40%, and the private rented sector we know is the least affordable. So on average, those who live on the private rented sector spend just under 30% of their income on housing. And so that could potentially be one reason. Secondly, we know that ethnic minorities tend to be younger than their white British counterparts. What this chart shows you is that for all ethnic groups, with the exception of the black Caribbean group, the proportion of adults aged 19 to 34 is higher relative to the white British group. And we know that when you're younger, you tend to have lower income and you're more likely to live in the private rented sector. So that could be one way that is potentially explaining the affordability gap as well relative to the white British group. Thirdly, region. Ethnic minorities are a lot more likely to live in London and the South East, renowned for their eye-watering house prices and eye-watering rents. And the gaps are quite substantial. So if you look here, you've got some groups that are nearly 50% of them, of their total adult population, live in London on the South East. So groups like your Chinese group, Bangladeshi, black Caribbean, black African, all nearly half of their total population live in that region. And we know that the average sort of amount of money that you spend on housing in London is 19%, which is higher than all other regions in the UK. And now we get a bit techie to try and emphasize, okay, we know these three things are going on. How much do they all explain the affordability gap? So I'll go through this bit quite slowly. So this is where we use our model analysis to estimate this. So I'll start with explaining what the white diamonds are on this chart. So the white diamonds here are the relative gap in how much you spend on your housing for each minority group relative to the white British group. So if we look all the way at the end there at the Arab group, that gap is 15 percentage points, because in the very first slide I showed you, the Arab group spends on average 26% of their income on housing, and the white British group spends 11%. So the gap there is 15 percentage points. If we come all the way down to the bottom of the chart, we see that for the Indian group, the gap's a lot smaller, because we saw that in terms of the differences in housing affordability, it was a lot smaller for the Indian group. Let's go back one. So now we look at what could explain it. So the first thing I want to draw your attention to is the black crosses on the chart. So what the black crosses on the chart show you are what we attribute through our model is explained by age, region, and tenure, in explaining that housing affordability gap for each minority relative to the white British group. And what you can see is that with the exception of the Pakistani group, tenure, age, and region explain at least half of the housing affordability gap for all minorities. So they play a big role. But when you sort of look deeper into it, what you can see is the size of the dark blue bars, tenure, basically what's driving everything. So tenure is really what's driving some of the big part of the housing affordability gap. Age actually has very little effect. And the reason why is because where it does affect housing affordability is through its correlation with tenure, i.e. you're more likely to rent privately when you're younger. And region also has quite a small effect, which might seem surprising. So we ascribe two reasons why we think region has quite a limited effect. The first is that outside London, housing affordability is actually pretty similar. The average you spend on housing, the average amount of income you spend on housing is pretty similar in all regions outside London. And actually within London, for some minority groups, they're a lot more likely to live in social housing relative to the white British group, and that could potentially also bring housing costs down and could potentially be another reason why we don't see much of a regional effect. And the last thing I want to point out on this chart is the grey bars. They are what we call the unexplained effect, i.e. what our model cannot attribute to age, region or tenure in explaining the housing affordability gap. And that's what the next part of this presentation will look into. Digging deeper into what could explain this unexplained gap, these grey bars that we're seeing. Oh. So could it be that larger household size mean minorities spend more for larger homes? So on average, what we see here is that with the exception of the black Caribbean group, the average number of people in a household for all ethnicities is higher than white British group. And at the extreme, it's quite a bit higher. So for instance, Pakistani households on average have an extra 2 people compared to white British households. So could it be that perhaps they require more rooms and that's more expensive, and as a result, we're seeing them spend more of their income on housing? The answer to that question is very much no. How do we know this? It's because ethnic minorities, with the exception of the Chinese group, all of them are significantly more likely to live in overcrowded homes than their white British counterparts. And at the extreme, it's really high. If you're looking at, for instance, the Pakistani, Black African, Black other group, for all of those groups, over 15% of adults live in overcrowded homes. So it's very much not that they're paying more to have more rooms, and that's why they're spending more of their income on housing. Are ethnic minorities paying more for better quality homes? And that's why we're seeing those housing affordability gaps? Again, the answer there is a categorical no. If we look here, what this chart shows you is, on average, how much do you spend on your housing on the bottom, the x-axis, and on the y-axis at the top, the proportion of homes with damp. And what we can again see there is, for instance, that Black African and Bangladeshi adults spend around twice as much more of their income on housing that is 3 times as likely to be damp compared to white British adults. So they're not spending more to get better quality housing either. So that cannot explain the housing affordability gap. Now we posit potentially another theory. Could it be down to preference, in the sense that some ethnic minorities might want to live in certain areas for which they potentially could pay a premium for? Now, it's really difficult to make any type of estimate in a theory like this. But what we can look at here is that for some ethnic groups, we see that given their average length of residence in the area, they have a stronger sense of belonging than we would expect. So what I want to really point out to here on this chart is the green dots. So if you look there, Arab and South Asian adults tend to have a really strong sense of belonging to their local area, over and above what we would expect given how long they've lived there. And could they potentially be paying a premium for this? That could potentially explain some of the grey bars, the unexplained effect. But much less positively, we also need to look at the flip side. Could it be a discrimination point? And what this chart shows you is that ethnic minorities are a lot more likely to experience discrimination when accessing housing. And the numbers are pretty stark. So this is the proportion of adults who report facing racial discrimination in accessing housing. So that could be through letting agents, that could be through estate agents. And what we see there is that for some groups, for instance, the Black African group at 6%, the Black Caribbean group at 7%, the Arab group at 9%, really high figures. And what's really important to note about this chart is this is just racial discrimination in accessing housing. This isn't broader discrimination. This is really specific. So what it could be the case is that it could be a complex mixture of both preference and penalty that is explaining that ethnic minority affordability gap relative to the white British group. So overall, this last chart, what it shows you is sort of a traffic light picture of all the different ethnic minorities' housing outcomes. And what it really emphasizes is why granular analysis is so important, going beyond white and BAME and going beyond white, Asian and Black. Because what we see here is that some minority groups are really at the sharp end of the crisis. So the Arab group, the Black African group and the Black other group consistently have really poor housing outcomes across all metrics. And that's why granular analysis is so important. And what it also tells us is that ethnic minorities will disproportionately benefit from tackling the high housing crisis, given they are currently at its sharpest end. And that's why what we call for in the report is that addressing ethnic inequalities should be in the government's long-term housing strategy that's forthcoming. And we also call for an official inquiry that looks particularly at discrimination in housing access, which is the final column that you can see on the right, where for some groups it's particularly high. And that's why we think is a really important area that needs to be looked at in the long term. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Cameron. It's so interesting. Florence, could we get your reaction? Absolutely.
I'll stand up. I feel like I've been sitting all morning. No, thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you for that, Cameron. Really insightful and interesting. But will I say I'm surprised? No, not really. This is information, if we're honest, that we all know already. And to see some of those figures you quoted is a stark reminder of why we have to address this from the root cause, which is access to good quality, affordable housing. I think about my own childhood, my own journey with social housing and the security good social housing provided me and my family. I think back to the days when we were in temporary accommodation, the days when we were in bed and breakfast, in a hotel, commuting, and to think that many years down the line now as an MP representing quite a diverse constituency and as the MP chairing the Housing, Communities and Local Government Select Committee, that's still happening. And that's predominantly still happening to our BME residents. And some of the figures that you outlined there in terms of the communities that are most impacted, and I do thank you for breaking down those different groups instead of lumping everyone as one homogenous group, because issues that an Arab family will face versus a Black Caribbean family will face will be totally different. And I think just in responding to that report, it's what areas do we feel that we need to look at? I think there are 3 key areas that we need to look at, and I think the first one is around affordability. I think the second one is around quality and price. And I think the last one is around the elephant in the room, the stigma associated with social housing, especially when you are a BME person. We don't talk about that enough. And in coming to the first one, I think we can see some of the changes that the government have outlined that they want to tackle. And the Renters' Rights Bill, which is currently going through Parliament, I think will be a game changer in addressing some of that. There are some key measures outlined in that in terms of giving more rights to the tenant. If we look at private renting, a lot of it is geared up and supporting the landlord. And this isn't about bashing landlords, because without landlords in the private rented sector, a number of councils would not be able to cope. We need the private rented sector. But what we are seeing is when we are paying more to the private rented sector in terms of housing temporary people on a temporary basis than we are spending on building homes, something has gone wrong. It's a case of when collectively the 32 London boroughs are spending £4 million a day on temporary accommodation instead of building, something has gone wrong in the private rented sector. It's when tenants who are paying their rent, who don't want to report some of the issues in their property for fear of being kicked out, but yet that landlord is taking so much money, something has gone wrong. It's about saying that successive governments have said we have a housing crisis, but since 2010 we have had 26 housing ministers. How much of this is a crisis? And I did say to Matthew Pennycook when he attended the committee, he's not allowed to resign. But this shows that actually we are failing so many people. We are failing a generation. We are failing young people. A new report showed that 74 children have died in the last 5 years in conditions linked to their temporary accommodation. We are seeing BME families having to travel, in some cases, 2 hours from their private rented accommodation to get to school and work. So it shows that the private rented sector is not working for certain communities. And when we look at the affordability, if I just use an example of my constituency, where on average, in the private rented sector, you could be renting a 1-bedroom flat on the 2nd floor with no garden for £2,200 per calendar month. If you took that money to the northeast, you could probably have a 5-bed detached house. Mortgage, not rent. And yet when you look at the conditions of those properties, you're wondering, why are people paying this? And then you wonder why people aren't able to save, to secure the deposit, to get onto the housing ladder. So I think what we need to do is around looking at how we turbocharge building, house building in this country, including making sure we are working with developers and councils to build social housing like the one that I grew up in, good quality social housing. Secondly, looking at the stuff around affordability and how we deal with the chronic conditions across houses. At our committee, we've had a session with some of the big housing associations, the G15, and a number of them are reporting back to us that they are spending more on repairs than they are on actually building. I challenged some of the chief execs because I said, from the casework I receive from my constituents, it doesn't seem like you're spending enough on repairs, because we see the pictures, they send me the videos, we see the emails. And they will argue back to me, and they did argue back to me, that the changes and the stagnation in terms of rent not keeping up with inflation has led to them not being able to invest. But then I'll challenge back to them, all the money that you've made, where have you invested that in the first instance? And we can't keep having this two-way prong. It's about, if we are saying that housing is really important and it's a basic human right, we need to invest in that housing properly. So I'll be pushing the government when we see the spending review later in the year in terms of how much money is going to go into the affordable homes programme to actually help housing associations and other developers come forward to build the affordable housing. We can't keep letting the claims around viability and affordability go down a waistline. This shouldn't be about profits. This should be about good quality homes that will provide the stability for a number of families. And that's what we want to see going forward. The last area I want to touch on is around the stigma and the racial discrimination. When you have a family where they are facing overcrowding and they're presenting to their landlord, be a council, a private landlord or a housing association, and when you hear some of the stories in the way people have been treated as if they're worthless, as if they're below the muck on your shoe. And these are the same people who, if they were late on their rent, they would feel the full weight of that landlord. They would get those letters in the post threatening with eviction. And what that just does to your mental state, knowing that you've been complaining about a leak, you've had to live in there, you've had to take matters into your own hands, you've had to whitewash the walls in terms of cleaning some of the damp, you've had to use your own money in terms of trying to deal with a rodent infestation when you are watching your newborn baby have mice and ants crawling around them. But yet your social landlord says there's nothing we can do and maybe you need to open your windows. And it's the way you live. The insult. The fact that for some people, English isn't their first language. And in some cases, they've been told you should be lucky you have a roof over your head. These are the issues that we are seeing within housing that we need to make sure we call out. We can't legislate for that stigma in social housing, but what we can do is make sure we are working with people who will treat their customers with respect, who will have a clear, robust issue in terms of challenging some of the racism that those tenants have said that they've faced. And if we're honest, we saw that with what happened in Grenfell. Those residents complained about the situation in their house, but the TMO didn't listen until it was too late. So going forward, it's really important that we are working with housing associations, councils and developers who are going to have a clear system of how they listen and engage with their residents. I attended an event a few weeks ago, again led by the G15 housing associations, where, to be fair, they're putting their money where their mouth is. They led on a report on challenging stigma in social housing. They're actually funding engagement panels with their residents on different estates, making sure that they're centre of those panels. And it's really, really vital, because actually, when you treat those same residents with that respect and duty of care, they will give back and look after their estates and communities. It's where they live. It's in their interest. And they want to do that. But when you're being treated with that disdain, why should they care as well? So just to finish off, to say this is something that is a big issue for us and we'll continue to look at within the committee. But I think ultimately it's how we address the chronic shortage of housing, the lack of affordability, and the issues around the different groups who are being, facing that stigma within social housing. And actually saying, for the people who live in those communities, it's their home and everyone deserves a good place to call home. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Florence. It's fantastic to hear your passion. Kwejo.
I honestly don't know how. I was throughout the whole thing, I was just here nodding. And I completely agree with everything that Florence has said. I think this work and this report is extremely important. I think the area that shocked me most was around that affordability. Learning about that and seeing the breakdown, it was in such detail, and I think it was really, really important. The sort of race element side to it, I mean, Florence took the words right out of her mouth in saying, like, I'm not shocked or surprised, and this is something that I see in regards to my line of work all the time. I think the important part within this is seeing that breakdown, and actually that there needs to be a focus within the renting sector in terms of black and ethnic minority groups, the way in which they are treated. And I know we spoke about Grenfell, and it says a lot around this issue, because often when I bring it up, people raise their eyebrows or roll their eyes when we're talking about race or minority groups. And yes, it's a huge class issue, and I think that conversation fundamentally has to happen, especially when it comes to affordability, but race isn't something that we should just dismiss. And that was something that we saw within the Grenfell inquiry, right? When it shouldn't have been dismissed, it fundamentally was. And I think that says a lot about the attitude around this conversation when we talk about housing, and fundamentally that needs to change. What this report has done is actually put the numbers behind what it is that many of us have been saying for many, many years. I think the area of one of the areas of most importance is around that stigma element. It's a huge, huge problem. It's something my own family has faced. We've seen firsthand when we were homeless and we had to turn to our council for housing, and then being turned away and having to live in a converted car garage and storage units because there was no homes available. The contempt my dad was treated with, but also travelling around over the last 4 years and campaigning, speaking to families up and down the country, all four corners of the country, saying they are experiencing similar. And again, I have said in terms of my work and going into homes where people are often living in what I can only describe as slum conditions, the vast majority of people are from minority backgrounds, minority groups, and they too are experiencing severe levels of poverty on top of that. But one of the issues they also bring up, as well as the conditions that they're living in, is that affordability and the amount of money they are having to spend, especially those living in homes with damp and mould when they're told to leave their windows open during winter. They're having to spend £70 a week just to keep the gas on so that they're not freezing in their homes. I'll never forget one case where it was snowing outside and they were having to leave all their windows open because they were told to do that by their provider, otherwise they would be blamed for those conditions that they're living in. And Florence mentioned it earlier on too, especially within the private rented sector, and it's good to see that the government is implementing changes around that. But residents for a very long time have been scared, and even in the social housing sector too, to raise some of the issues that they are living with, issues that are putting their health and safety at risk because of fear that they are going to be evicted for doing that. And there are cases where that has happened fundamentally. I've spoken to social housing tenants who are frightened to raise those issues and concerns because they don't want to be seen as a pain. And especially within social housing, I cannot tell you the amount of times where I've heard it that residents are told, well, you've got a roof over your head, you should be lucky, you're paying X amount of money in rent, less than everyone else, you shouldn't be complaining. Even living in a home where your home is being flooded by sewage, or you're having to live with a cockroach infestation, which puts your health and safety at risk. The way in which housing is viewed in this country is completely wrong. And we've seen it for a very long time as a commodity, as an accumulation of wealth, a representation of wealth, rather than a human right and a fundamental to the lives of all of us. And that affordability side of things has to be looked into, and I definitely think race should be included in that off of the back of the data that we've seen here today. And I know we've got the Renters' Rights Bill coming in, but there's not much within that talking about affordability yet. That is the elephant in the room. When renters are, in many cases, spending more than 50% of their monthly income on rent, how can we expect them to, I don't know, one day own their own home or have the possibility to even save? How do we expect them to pay that rent, but also on top of that, pay all of their other bills at the end of the month, make sure they're putting clothes on their back or the backs of their kids, feed themselves, and it not affect their mental health? And on top of that, many of the homes in the private rented sector don't meet the decent home standard. It is an absolute and complete mess. I think going forward off of the back of this and seeing the numbers, it's no longer about just saying, oh, this is an issue that's happening. The numbers and data is there. And it's about time we stop just rolling our eyes at the issue of race whenever it is brought up, and actually we tackle it head on and say, this is a problem, the numbers are there, now how do we deal with it? And there are many things that I think personally that the government could do. Florence mentioned it earlier around affordability. Like I mentioned, there has to be a focus within the private rented sector, because we saw from the data that is where the majority of people are and where they're struggling most with affordability. Especially within the social housing sector around stigma. They've talked about changing things. Well, what does that look like? And how is that going to be meaningful and more than just a tick box exercise? So there are many things that the government needs to do, but it first and foremost starts with accountability and admitting that there is a problem here. So I hope they take this report forward. I hope they take the data forward, the learnings from the data too, and actually look at areas where they can improve the lives of people up and down the country who at the moment are having to suffer in silence because they fundamentally aren't listened to and haven't been listened to for far too long. That's what they need to do. They need to tackle it head on.
Thank you very much. So we will take some questions now. We have a microphone for some questions in the room. So I'll take both of those, and we'll bring up one from online as well.
Thank you very much. Lovely to see you again. Yes, it's an incredible report, and I'm really pleased that you've looked at this again. I know Resolution Foundation looked at this a couple of years ago with UCL, so it's great that the data's come out. Now, I'm going to come at this with three hats on. First of all, as a member of Independent SAGE, the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergency, Kwajo, you touched on this, and I think it's a really important point, which is that I think the distribution of housing, the affordability, the overcrowding, and the disproportionate impact on Black and ethnic minority groups means that it's a public health issue. We saw that in the pandemic. We saw that to a great extent that housing became the difference between life and death. So I think that's the first thing that I want to say, and I hopefully, Florence, that the select committee could look at that aspect. The second thing I want to say, with my hat on as the former deputy director of the Runnymede Trust, is housing costs, especially in the private rented sector, disproportionately explains the levels of child poverty among Black, Bangladeshi and Pakistani groups. We know that. There's something like 76% of Black African groups, 76% of Black African children in poverty live in private rented sector. So I think that needs to be taken account of as well. We know that the Child Poverty Review is taking place. We need to link those dots. The third thing I want to say, as the former deputy director of a women's budget group, is there's also a gender dimension to this. I completely appreciate why the two of you didn't disaggregate by gender, but once you disaggregate by gender, there's enormous consequences. There's not a single English region in this country where the median rent is affordable on women's median earnings, right? The other thing is lone parents. We have to think about lone parents. Disproportionately, women, 2/3 of lone parents are homeless with children. So we need to think about it in terms of gender as well, and hopefully the select committee as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let's take one at the back, and then I'll let you come back because that was quite a lot of questions at once.
Yeah, hello, I'm Yao Barton from the Stop Social Housing Stigma. I'm the deputy chair. Florence, you said something very important, and that's to do with stigma. It's one of those intangible items, but the thing is, it's big and very big. And one of the proofs of the stigma aspect of things is when you hear about the disrepair claims that people are putting in, they are enormous. And because I'm a tenant of Croydon Council, and we had a meeting, and I said to them that what are you doing about all these disrepair claims? Because councils, well, landlords are broke at the moment, and every single day we have new councils getting broke. what is being done about it. I know Francis said that the government can't legislate against stigma because you can't see it. But I feel what can be done is indirectly influencing different bodies like the Ombudsman, for example, the way the Ombudsman deals with complaints. Because I'm also on the complaints panel of my landlord. And sometimes when we have complaints, I just sit down and wonder, didn't anyone think at least the impact that this issue is having on this person? I mean, Koji, you mentioned about cockroaches and all that kind of stuff. The last place I saw cockroaches was when I was in Ghana. And I couldn't believe that you come into a country like Britain and there are people who are living with cockroaches and other venom. Something needs to be done. And Florence, I appreciate your work and all that kind of stuff. Something needs to be done. The question is what and when.
Look, great question. So I think the relationship with child poverty, we had a question similar online about the relationship between housing and health, the role of gender, and also stigma and what can be done there. And I don't know if we can bring John's question up, Alessia, but there's a question which I think related to the stigma point about whether we think there is institutional racism in local authorities and housing associations. So do you want to react to some of that, Florence?
No, thank you. Really, really important questions there, and good to see you again, Yael. And I think, and just to thank you for the work that you're doing on pushing the issues around social stigma. I think, so in terms of addressing the stigma, I think it's something that I do want the government to look at seriously. And if you recall, when the Prime Minister responded to the Grenfell inquiry, he did touch on that in his speech. The government are due to come back in March, I think, to report back on the recommendations. They haven't come back on the full recommendations. I'm hoping that when they do address the issue around stigma, and I know that it's something that the Deputy Prime Minister has taken a keen interest in. So I think you're right. It's how we send a strong signal to the housing sector around how they will deal and engage with their tenants, especially their black and minority ethnic tenants, around some of the practices that you know, frankly, are just disgraceful. On all your wider points, it's around. You know, I'm hoping that the Child Poverty Task Force are looking at the race dimension in this as well. We know that, again, you know, so many families are dealing with housing costs. You look at lone parents that are dealing with, you know, childcare costs alone. That eats up a large percentage of your budget, which reduces where you can rent. You know, your options are limited because by the time you've taken all those costs into account. And you're right, it is a public health issue because we were able to address the issue of rough sleeping during COVID, right? We were able to clear everyone off the streets, but yet we look at the issue of homelessness and it's gone up again. It's such a big issue, and it's one of the issues we've looked at on the Select Committee in terms of we need to stop this cycle of sort of every November, and October, November, we allocate a big pot of funding to deal with the winter months. We know that there's going to be a surge in rough sleeping in the winter months and we need to get people out off the streets. We can't keep doing the same things. And Lord John Bird attended our Select Committee, and you know, you could visibly see his frustration because he left the committee because he said, you know, he's been talking about this for years. The government successive governments keep doing the same thing, and that's the situation that, you know, we find people. So it's about, you know, going to what Kodja said in terms of basic human rights around the right to a roof over your head. And I think just lastly on the gender dimension as well, it's around looking at the fact that for some women who are fleeing domestic abuse and domestic violence, where housing is used against them, and you know, those women will present to their councils because sometimes the tenancy is in the male counterpart's name, and you'll find a woman presenting to the council, and it's a case of the council's effectively saying, well, you know, can you patch things up? No, I can't, with the person who's beating me black and blue. And then you'll find those women being placed in unsuitable accommodation, far away, you know, from the areas where the children go to school. So all of that feeds into some of the issues around the link between housing, health and education. There is no statutory duty if a family are placed in another local borough, another in terms of temporary accommodation, for the schools to be informed. Make that make sense. So again, we are failing a generation of children in terms of their learning patterns. And you wonder why, you get teachers complaining that children are turning up to school late, they're not learning. Most of the time when I visit the schools in my constituency, the head teacher's raising housing cases with me. Can we have someone in your office to deal with these housing cases? It keeps coming up. So we need to make sure all the different departments are working together as opposed to the silos which everyone is used to.
Absolutely. Just completely spot on. I would have said the exact same thing. I mean, we're all saying the exact same things. In terms of stigma, I know the government, it underpins a lot of what we are seeing in regards to the housing crisis, especially within social housing, the private rented sector. I know the government plans to come back in March. My question to the government is going to be, well, who are they talking to? Is it simply just policymakers, or are they actually getting out there and speaking to the people that have been directly affected by that? The people that have suffered, are they informing those sorts of recommendations and future policies from government, because they are the most important people that should be influencing those decisions. In regards to public health issue, absolutely 100% it is a public health issue. I think 2022, 2023, the NHS spent £1.4 billion looking after people living in poor housing conditions, right? And I'm sure that number's probably increased since then. It affects people's health, it affects people's mental health. In all the homes that I go into and I speak to residents who have been ignored time and time again, they talk to me about the impact on their mental health. I'd probably say all the homes I go into, I've experienced it myself. So it is a public health issue, and that's how we should be viewing the housing crisis, not, oh, this person doesn't have a roof over their head. It is impacting their health. And if they're living in poor conditions, it is going to make them sick. A prime example of that was Alb Ishak, the two-year-old boy that died in Rochdale as a result of living in a home filled with damp and mould. He didn't have a say in that at all. And there was a third point in terms of the private rented sector. And I think that is an important conversation to have, because we talk about the private rented sector too and people just renting in the private sector, but also what we need to acknowledge is when families become homeless, right, and they turn to local authorities, they don't have the council homes to put them in. So often they have to rely on the private rented sector to put those families into. And often those are extremely poor conditions. One example, a young man that I was speaking to only a couple of weeks ago in Croydon had been placed into temporary accommodation with a rat infestation, living with 4 other people. He was living in a room. The council's paying £1,400 per month for that room, yet they're living in absolute dire disrepair. And what I'd like to know and find out actually is specifically around kids and homeless figures, because we've seen that number increase to 161,000 homeless kids. But what I haven't seen as of yet is that breakdown in terms of race. And I think that would be eye-opening and I think enlightening to actually find out, well, what is that breakdown there? Because if it is what we think it is, then there absolutely has to be the same sort of conversations happening around homelessness too, and child homelessness and poverty also. And there's a really quick question here that says, Quajo mentioned poverty. Do the panelists think poor housing affects people's earning power? Absolutely. If you are living in a home which is falling to bits, again, I've experienced this myself. I was going to drop out of university because of the impact it was having on my mental health. And everyone living in those sorts of conditions, it massively impacts their mental health. I've spoken to people who have quit their jobs and had to quit their jobs because of the impact on their mental health, had to quit education. But on top of that, physically becoming ill because you're being forced to live in sort of rat, cockroach infested homes with damp and mould. It's going to make you physically ill. You're going to have to take time out of work. So it directly impacts your earning power. And again, that is something that has to be looked at. And that comes back to it being a public health crisis and emergency. And that's how it should be treated.
Thank you so much. And Quasia and Florence, you've both mentioned homelessness and temporary accommodation there. I wonder if you might tell us a bit about what the report found on homelessness.
Yeah, so I'm wondering, Alicia, if we might be able to bring a chart up that I didn't show in the report, where we actually did look at temporary accommodation, breaking that down by ethnicity. And so what this chart sort of shows us is the share of each ethnic group's total population in the red bar, and the share of population who are either homeless or threatened with homelessness. So they're either owed prevention duty by council or owed relief duty by council. And what you can see there is that some minority groups are really at the sharp end of the temporary accommodation crisis. So your Black African, Black Caribbean and Arab groups, they're heavily overrepresented in the homeless population. There you can see their blue bars are a lot bigger than their red bars. And sort of to put that into a perspective, so the white British population is about 75% of the population of the country. In terms of the homeless population, they're about 62%. So they're heavily underrepresented. And it is the case that some minorities are also underrepresented. So for instance, the Indian population is underrepresented. But what we do see is that some minorities are really at the sharp end of this temporary accommodation crisis. And more than any, it's the Black African group, where you can see nearly 8% of the homeless population are from a Black African background. And that's way higher than their total share of the population.
I think just looking at that, it comes back to, you know, Quadri would have seen this in his visits. I see it in visits across the constituency. And your research touched on it in terms of larger family sizes. We have to look at the cultural element as well. For a number of Black minority ethnic communities and groups, the culture is that the children stay at home until they move on to marry or form their own households. So you'll have, and I normally have, you know, families presenting where the children are adults, you know, 25, 31, they're still at home because actually for them, saving to get that deposit is quite hard. For a number of them, they're taking on additional duties in terms of their carers for their parents, their carers for their grandparents. So again, all of that it needs to be factored into why we have bigger family units. And what you'll generally find is when those families are presenting to be rehoused, the duty will only be on the children that are underage, under 16, or the main tenants. And you know, in terms of rehousing that family in a 3-bedroom or 4-bedroom, legally on paper it will say you can only be rehoused in a 1-bedroom flat, which is not going to do anything. And you know, when you think about breaking up that family unit, the additional cost, like I said, for a number of people who are acting as carers, they are saving the NHS a lot of money. And we see the issue in terms of the NHS and you know, the crisis we're seeing there. But actually, if we were to stop all those families caring for some of their elderly parents, taking time out of work, going back to what Quadri mentioned in terms of their earning power, because they've got additional duties that are placed on them within the home that they're caring for. So again, you know, these are some of the things that we need to be having open conversations around and about, and how we address this.
I think I was going to really quickly say in regards to overcrowding too, we can expect that to increase if we don't get the homes that we need. And it will fundamentally increase because we're seeing it already in terms of the homes that are overcrowded, and young people in particular. More and more young people are finding it impossible to move out of their homes and go into the private sector or buy their own home. So what does that mean? They're going to continue living with their parents and creating families within those homes, and those homes by default are going to become overcrowded. And that comes directly back down to the affordability crisis and why this is an issue that needs to be fundamentally addressed by government. It is the elephant in the room, and they cannot continue over the next 5 years to simply stand by and just ignore it. Long term, yes, building the homes is going to help. If we flood the market with homes, we can expect prices to even out slightly. But short term, during this crisis, the question is, what are we going to do? Because ultimately it's going to cost them more, but it's also going to cost families like this a lot more too. So that's what I was getting from this.
Really important points, and I think it brings us on a bit to what we could do about all of this and what we should encourage the government to do. We've got a poll which maybe we could bring up, and I will take some more questions as well. I mean, I think a lot of us would want to say yes to more than one of these at least, but I think they pick up on some of the things that we've talked about. But I suppose I might ask the panel, we've talked about building more homes, building more social housing. We've talked about the Renters' Rights Bill, but also enforcement of that and whether that goes far enough. And you've emphasised affordability in particular, and whether we need to do something about that in the short term. So as people vote, if they would like to online, perhaps I could ask for your views on which of these might be the most important.
All of them.
Absolutely all of them. I mean, long term, we need homes. We need more homes, that is a definite, and that is the solution to a lot of issues long term. But around short term, strengthen renters' rights, that should have always been the case, I think. Enforcement is more important than just having it written down on a piece of paper and creating a law out of it, because that's all good and well. But if it's not enforced, people are going to continue facing the same sort of issues that they're facing now. Rent controls is an issue that no one wants to have at the moment, but ties directly into affordability. And we know in this country that we had it. I think it was after the First World War is when it was introduced, or during the First World War, when things became unaffordable and we simply didn't have the homes that we needed. And I think we had it up until 1980 something. But in regards to that rent control, I don't know exactly in what form it will look like, but it will benefit not just renters, but also the government too, because we look at the housing benefit costs that they are currently having to pay out, and we're seeing that's increasing and continues to increase. And we have to realise and get to a point where we draw a line and say it's just become completely unaffordable. It needs to be fair, I think. And Angela Rayner, Rachel Reeves, Keir Starmer have all said, like I have said, that this is the biggest housing crisis we have faced since the Second World War. And therefore, I believe we need a similar response to what we saw after that. And we know after the First World War, they introduced some form of rent control. And in terms of affordability, if that is in just the major cities, it's something they need to consider. I know Sadiq Khan, he has said and been calling for it for a long time. And it's the elephant in the room that has to be addressed.
Florence?
No, I agree with all those points, but I think for me, it's building more homes and something else. Building more homes, including social housing, because if we're honest, there's almost a push of you must own. A number of people want to rent, and we shouldn't be ashamed about that. But what's stopping people having that security of tenure is that threat of being evicted, is that threat of actually when something goes wrong, your landlord is not going to fix it. And you know, I'm one of three girls. My youngest sister lives in the Netherlands. She's lived there for almost 12 years. Her and her husband have rented. And it's a case of how do we provide that security that you get with a good quality social housing where you pay your rent and your landlord will uphold their right. It's a two-way contract, right? And I think we need to see more, you know, we need to talk proudly about why it's important to have good quality social homes that people can rent, whether it's council-led, whether it's even developer-led or housing association, you know, pushing that more. And when there are issues, you know, the landlord being able to fix that. So how do we build more homes? Of that 1.5 million a government have committed to by the end of this parliament, I want to push them on how many are going to be social housing. You know, we need large figures in that to address this issue. In terms of something else, it's around working with the sector. We can't keep doing things how we have. Whether it's people complaining to the ombudsman and, you know, taking a long time to get response, whether it's tenants feeling that, you know, that they're being forced to leave, well, uproot and leave. So things do have to change, and that will come from the tone and the way the government are dealing and working with providers, but equally making sure that the very people, as Kojo said, who live in these properties are central to some of those conversations. It can't just be an exercise of consultation at the end, we'll get your views. No, front and centre. If we're designing a new town, if we're planning new areas, if we're going to build new properties, making sure the people who are going to live there are involved in those conversations. Yes, people will always resist to change. But actually, when you involve people from the beginning, they'll feel that things have been done with them and not to them. For far too long, people have felt that things have been done to them, and it's really important that we look at that. So I'd say, you know, build more homes, including social housing, something else, including, you know, getting people involved, and something else also includes dealing with the issue of leasehold. Massive, massive issue that so many people who've been able to make the jump to purchase and now dealing with. Why should they be lumbered with those charges and having to pay for that? So that's what I want the government to do.
And just touching upon that point, I think, of affordability and leasehold, we have seen, even with home ownership, this idea, and it was rammed down our throats, especially after sort of Margaret Thatcher's government, that housing and owning your own home was the thing to do. It provided you with that security that you needed. Well, absolutely it doesn't, because we are seeing that, and we've been seeing that play out for the last few years. Whereas even in the private rented sector, all people are asking for, I believe, and you can see it from other countries, like places like Vienna in Germany, is if in the private rental sector people had stability, affordability and security, they'll be more happy just to simply rent.
Right.
I know certainly I would, but unfortunately in this country we don't have that. For a very long time everyone needs to own their own home, and for the last 40 years it hasn't worked. For the next 5 years it's not going to work. So we need to, not for everyone, especially off the back of a cost of living crisis, so therefore we have to be making sure within the rental sector is that stability, affordability and security, but also touching upon leasehold too, that the state of leasehold is sorted, because that is another area of the housing crisis, a massive area of the housing crisis, which has just simply been neglected for far too long.
Let's bring up the results of the poll, and we did have a question online about right to buy and whether instead of kind of modifying eligibility, build more, we should be ruling it out. But I think we can probably guess your answers to that question as to whether right to buy should be a priority. So let's take a few more questions in the room. Yeah.
Thank you, Andrew Bosey, London Forum. There are plenty of unimplemented planning permissions, and that's because the private sector exists to make a profit, and the easiest way to make a profit is to ensure that demand exceeds supply. The way, well, there's two ways around. One is to have more money to housing associations and local authorities. The other is to increase volume, which would obviously meet the targets. The trouble with increasing volume is that there are not enough construction workers. No one seems to be addressing this point, and part of the problem is that there's too much pandering to the Daily Mail over immigration. We need immigrants to come and build the houses that we don't have the people here to build. We need to get on the front foot and start talking about the benefits of immigration. And if we did that, maybe some of the racial discrimination would go away.
And let's take one more question over there. And sorry, then I'm going to be out of time. At the back, Clara?
Thank you. I'm just wondering, based on your research, was there ever a ponder about how accessibility needs might affect people from minority backgrounds?
How are we going to build all these homes? And really important question about housing access, where perhaps, Cameron, you'd like to say a bit more about this inquiry as well. And I'm sorry, I know we've got more questions, but unfortunately we need to wrap up. So I'll ask each of the panellists for their kind of closing thoughts as well. Kwejo, do you want to go first?
Oh yes, I will. In terms, you're absolutely spot on, and this is something that a conversation that I had with the previous government. We were even talking about it then. Brexit. It's in terms of construction and housing has massively damaged our ability to provide the homes that we fundamentally need. Because essentially what we were telling people to do was go back to where they came from, essentially, and we failed to realise that actually those construction workers were needed in order to build the infrastructure that this country so desperately needs, especially now during this housing crisis. I speak to housing association bosses and people that work within the social housing sector, and they are genuinely concerned at the moment of how we are going to build the homes, because in terms of the labour, in terms of the construction workers, there's such a small pool at the moment that we've got because of everything that happened after Brexit, and demand is so high at the moment. Even around simple repairs, for example, we don't have that sort of pool of talent to choose from. We don't have that competitiveness that we once did. And what's happened now, especially in terms of repairs, and this speaks to the wider issue around how we're going to build those homes, is we've got organisations which fundamentally aren't, we talk about in terms of social housing, the contractors that they use to carry out repairs. And the quality is so poor. The quality and standard is so poor, but they all have to continue using them because we have no other option. And we don't have that competitiveness that we once did. And the question is, well, how is that government going to reverse that to one, make sure that we are improving the standards of people's homes, but two, making sure that competitiveness, that labour force, those construction workers, developers are there to actually build the homes and for an affordable sort of price, because if supply is so limited, costs are going to be through the roof, I think. So that's a hurdle that they're fundamentally going to have to overcome. How they do that, I don't know, but it's something they're going to have to address sooner rather than later, and certainly not in 4 years' time from now.
Great, thank you. Florence?
No, thank you. Really important question on that, Andrew, and it's something that we've touched on, the Select Committee, and something which I think we'll definitely want to look at when we bring forward the legislation on the National Planning Policy Framework. So you have a situation where a number of councils up and down the country, right down to even the departments that are dealing with the applications, there's no staff there. So we've seen a massive injection of 300 additional planners across the country. But with my discussion with the Local Government Association, who speak and represent all councils, that 300 is not enough. But it goes back to some of the additional other work on this committee that we are looking at in terms of local government finance. Because the stark reality is for a number of councils, they are at a situation where they are thinking, do we reduce the team in the planning department or do we reduce children's social workers? That's the stark reality. And we need to get to a situation where we are not saying it's not about the planners or social work, it's about both, because you need the planner to be able to work with developers and housing associations to bring forward the plans and development so that we can build the social housing, that the social worker that's dealing with that complex family can then refer to the planning department to say, yes, this family should be prioritised for the new housing that's going to be built. We are not having that. In terms of the skill force and the workforce, the National Housing Federation attended our Select Committee and Federation of Small Builders. They have sent alarm bells on this. They said that the sector has been decimated. We do not have enough engineers, plumbers, electricians, all the key tradespeople that we need to help with building these properties that we want to see, this 1.5 million. Even down to the materials, the bricks we are going to use to build some of these properties. So the government needs to be making sure, as we are changing the planning policy, we are also looking at the skill sector in terms of bringing forward the people who are going to work within that sector. There is a massive skills gap, and that will help in terms of addressing the issue around growth, because people who are working will contribute towards the tax and pay their fair share. So all of this goes hand in hand. I think it's fair to say that Department for Housing, Communities and Local Government, they sit within almost every key area of the government's key missions: growth, building, crime, education. All of that falls within housing, communities and local government. So it's really important that we are working as a whole piece and not just looking at this in isolation. On your question, accessibility for BME communities, I think one of the other areas which the predecessor committee, the committee before, looked at was around for people from disability backgrounds and their issues with housing. And I think this is something that we do need to definitely look at, and their needs when we are talking about the impact on Black and minority ethnic people. So I think it's something that we'd want to look at going forward.
Thank you. Cameron, anything you wanted to wrap up with?
I want to just briefly touch on planning, because we did, I want to give a plug to a report we published at the back end of last year on planning reform and called Building Blocks, and whether the government's planning reforms alone will be enough for them to hit the 1.5 million target. And I think the reality that came out of that report is that while the target is so ambitious, even in a historical context, that the last time that it was reached, the share that was built by the public sector is a lot higher than it is now. And actually the planning reforms at the moment as they stand are quite modest. There's actually scope to go further with them in terms of being more radical in terms of planning reform. So we think that planning reform alone probably isn't going to be enough to hit that 1.5 million target, and there needs to be a wave of other reforms alongside it. And just on accessibility, it's such a well-made point, and I think that's something. It's so important not to ever treat anything like this in isolation, because ethnicity, when you combine it with gender, when you combine it with disability, that's when you can really start to see some of the groups that are hardest hit. I think one of the challenges with all ethnicity data is that a sample size because we were really keen. We wanted to go below white, Asian, black. That meant that sample size is always going to be an issue, and we set ourselves strict contingents. But also, and it's a bigger problem sort of broadly, societies often in these surveys, they only collect the ethnicity of the person who responds to the survey, the household reference person. But actually, if we look at our country now, nearly 10% of households are multi-ethnic. So actually, that's why it's so important to go beyond that. And I think that's probably where I'd end upon, is that granular analysis is so important going forward. And that's what we really try to emphasise in the report.
Well, look, I know Florence has to go. It's been a fantastic discussion. I think the role of the rental sector, the kind of, we started with housing, but really housing is fundamental to so many issues. The need to talk about stigma and race, and also issues around homelessness and temporary accommodation. And sounds like hopefully some food for thought for the government on, if they're going to build 1.5 million homes, how many of those will be affordable social housing. So thank you very much for joining us, both here and online, and huge thanks to Florence and Quajo for